Understanding cost. Right. As I said earlier, some of the key terminologies which we have to understand is going to be like we have defined service, we know what output is and what outcome is, and some of the other concepts what we want to understand is cost and risk. Costs refer to the amount of money spent on a specific activity or resource. From the perspective of service consumer, there are two types of cost involved in service relationship. Cost removed from the consumer by the service, which is part of the value proposition. This may include cost of staff, technology, and other resources which the consumer doesn't need to provide. And then there's cost imposed on the consumer by the service, the cost of service consumption. The total cost of consuming a service would include the price charged by the service provider, if applicable, plus other costs such as staff training, cost of network utilization, procurement, etc. Some consumers describe this as what they have to invest in order to consume the service. Regardless, both types of costs are considered when the consumer assesses the value which they expect the service to create. To ensure that correct decisions are made about the service relationship, it is important that both types of cost are fully understood. From the provider's perspective, a full and correct understanding of cost of service provision is vital. Provider needs to ensure that services are delivered within the budget constraint and meets the financial expectations of the organization. A risk is a possible event that could cause harm or loss or make it more difficult to achieve the objective. Risk can also be defined as uncertainty of outcomes and can be used in the context of measuring the probability of positive outcomes as well as negative outcomes. Just like cost, there are two types of risk that are common to service consumers. Their risk removed from a consumer by a service as part of the value proposition. These may include failure of the consumer service hardware or lack of service staff availability. In some cases, a service may only reduce a consumer's risk, but the consumer may determine what this reduction is sufficient to support the value proposition. And then there's a risk imposed on a consumer by the service. That's the risk of service consumption. Let's take an example that a service provider is experiencing a security or data breach. It's the duty of the provider to manage the detailed level of risk on behalf of the consumer. This should be handled based on a balance of what matters most to the consumers and to the providers. The consumers contribute to the reduction of risk in three ways: by actively participating in the definition of the requirement of the service and clarification of required outcomes, by clearly communicating the critical success factors and the constraints that applies to the service, and ensuring that service providers have access to the necessary resources of the consumers throughout the service relationship.